Dark Souls 2, the successor to the genre-defining Dark Souls, takes players on another punishing journey. Unlike the original, Dark Souls 2 wasn't directed by the mastermind Hidetaka Miyazaki, and instead, From Software put Tomohiro Shibuya and Yui Tanamura at the helm. It's not like Miyazaki turned his back on the series though, as he would soon go on to direct the third installment. Instead, he felt confident in his team and wanted to put his entire focus on the smash hit Bloodborne for PlayStation. With his entire focus on the PlayStation exclusive title, Dark Souls 2 was built with a completely different vision. Despite the original creator of the series taking a back seat, Dark Souls 2 is still as ambitious and a grand effort to create one of the best experiences in the Souls-like genre. However, many fans continue to debate this testament. Dark Souls 2 has its own traits that are different from the original, some of which work in its favour while others stumble in comparison. One of the biggest complaints by fans at launch was the bad enemy placement, atrocious runbacks to bosses, and frustrating hitboxes, all making the game feel unfair and filled with artificial difficulty. These complaints quickly gained traction within the Souls community, doing the game a disservice. Since Dark Souls 1 was already regarded as a classic, and Dark Souls 3 earned universal praise 3 years later, the flaws of Dark Souls 2 became more pronounced over time. As a result, its positives have been overshadowed, and the game has come to be known as the black sheep of the series. However, it's worth putting that stigma aside and giving Dark Souls 2 another try, as it's still a fantastic game in its own right and deserves the attention of any Souls-like fan. One of the most notable differences between the first and second Dark Souls is the combat system. While the foundation still focuses on learning enemies' attack patterns, Dark Souls 2's combat is more fast-paced and requires quicker reflexes. It's a nice change in pace and makes the sequel feel more of an action game compared to the original, in which the combat was slow and methodical. However, because of its faster nature, the game evens the playing field by including more aggressive enemies that don't always work. As mentioned in the intro to this review, the enemy placement is the game's weakest aspect. Aggressive enemies and bad enemy placement is a terrible combination that can result in combat encounters that can be best described as jank and unfair. However, the game isn't entirely filled with these moments, and when the combat works, it can arguably be considered leagues ahead of the combat system in the original Dark Souls due to its fluidity and depth. The increased mobility for dodging, tighter and more responsive controls, and an incredibly diverse number of weapons allow players to experiment more with their builds and playstyle. Additionally, the refined mechanics for dual wielding keep the combat fresh throughout the game's entirety, making progression more exciting overall. Unfortunately though, some areas are so flooded with enemies that it can prevent the combat from reaching its full potential and can result in a frustrating experience rather than a rewarding one. Still, even though some levels are too cluttered with enemies, the game makes up for it by having incredible bosses with some of the best attack patterns of any Souls game. Almost all the bosses in Dark Souls 2 have complex yet fair move sets that require a strong strategy to overcome. Players will need to learn and dedicate a ton of time to learning a boss's mechanics, even more so than in the original, which is the most exciting aspect of any Souls-like game. Bosses aren't just exciting to fight against either, as they are also visually appealing and offer deep lore that adds to the encounter. Some examples include the Old Iron King, a king who recently turned into a giant winged demon, or Mitha, who was once a queen but was driven mad due to consuming poison because her love interest didn't feel the same. The rich lore, beautiful designs, and fantastic attack patterns make Dark Souls 2 bosses the strongest aspect of the game. Dark Souls 2 offers an expansive world with an ambitious and varied level design, bringing both positives and some drawbacks. Like the original, Dark Souls 2 presents levels filled with secret pathways and illusory walls, but it lacks the interconnectedness of the first. The absolute best feeling of the original Dark Souls was exploring the world and magically ending up back at Firelink Shrine. With almost zero idea of how that happened, the designs of each level overlapped and molded into one another, almost feeling like a labyrinth. Unfortunately, Dark Souls 2 removes this feeling by focusing more on linearity, even though the levels are bigger overall. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, and the open levels are beautiful aesthetically, but this design choice makes exploration not as impactful, and due to the open areas, the game is more of an excuse to throw hordes of enemies at the player. Additionally, due to the increase in level sizes, the runbacks to bosses can be an annoyance and prevent the game from remaining at a steady pace. This is especially true when you look at the bonfire checkpoint system. Dark Souls 2 follows the same principle of resting at bonfires and using them as a checkpoint, but they are further apart from one another than the original. The fact that bonfires are more spread out in large areas and the game has fewer shortcuts compared to other games by From Software, dying at the boss and having to start from the checkpoint just to run all the way back and try again can quickly grow tedious. If the game had more shortcuts that opened up paths to bosses, or the bonfires were closer together, then dying to a boss wouldn't be such a frustration. This is where players can really see the lack of influence from Hidetaka Miyazaki, one of the driving factors for the impeccable level design of the rest of From Software's creations. Still, even though the areas may not reach the heights of other games in the developer's catalogue from a layout perspective, they are still better than most games on the market and are still an example of why From Software has earned its title as one of the best developers in the industry. Take Majula, for example, the main hub of the game. Unlike Firelink Shrine, Majula has more personality and includes some of the best music in the entire series. In fact, Dark Souls 2 has the best music in the entire series overall, no questions asked. Any Souls fan will agree to the testament that the atmosphere reaches new heights when there's a soundtrack to match. Dark Souls 2 may lack the creative and maze-like level design of the first, but there are moments in the game that fans will always remember. Some unforgettable moments include trekking through the memories of the ancients, a moment that showcased how deep the lore goes and what it was like before the game's events. Or the fight against the Burnt Ivory King, where the player drops into a deep hole with soldiers at their side ready to take on the blazing foe. Better yet, how about joining the Pilgrims of the Dark Covenant and finding the secret Dark Lurker boss? These are incredible moments in Dark Souls history. Dark Souls 2 has a lot of valleys, but the peaks stand out enough to help forgive the low points. Majula, the hub area mentioned earlier in this review, is another prime example. There's nothing better than first discovering Majula as the sun is shining down, a majestic tune playing and the cliff overlooking the sea with a distance as far as the eyes can see. Progressing through the game will slowly have Majula filling up with characters almost as if you're building your own community and team of allies. There's a feeling of hope, while also not removing the eerie dread the series is known for. The DLC presents moments like these as well, such as Frozen Elim Lois, a beautifully coloured area that takes place in a temple riddled with freezing storms. The ambience of some areas in Dark Souls 2 helps create some memorable experiences, and while not all of them hit the mark, it makes progressing through the game exciting, as it's hard not to be thrilled about what comes next. Dark Souls 2 has more problems than any other game in From Software's library, such as terrible enemy placement and horrendous runbacks to bosses. However, It's a From Software game, meaning their worst is still better than most developers out there. Dark Souls 2 is a brilliant game that offers exciting combat, a beautiful atmosphere, superb boss designs, and an endless amount of build customization. Tons of Souls-like fans look at this sequel as a bad entry and the black sheep of the series, and that may be true when comparing it to other Dark Souls games, but in reality, the best way to describe Dark Souls 2 is a flawed masterpiece. Because that's what it is. It's a masterpiece that has some questionable design choices and glaring issues, but still remains worthy of anyone's time who's a fan of the genre.